Hello, A pushers, and welcome back. Today's lesson is going to be on the Second Great Awakening and the reform movements of the Second Great Awakening. So let's get started. We remember that there was an original Great Awakening in the early 1700s, and the original Great Awakening inspired Americans to come together as a colony to fight against the British. The first Great Awakening is going to happen in the early 1700s, 1730s, 1740s in New England. The Second Great Awakening is going to happen about exactly 100 years later. It's going to be in the 1830s and the 1840s in the New England states. The Second Great Awakening is going to have two different things to it. It's going to have reform movements, which we're going to spend most of the time talking about, and then we're also going to talk about new religions as well that go along with this Great Awakening. So we talked about there are 5 different reform movements. I gave you a graphic organizer beforehand, and we're going to go into these very quickly. Temperance, prison asylums, asylum reform, abolition, women's rights, and eventually education. And so these 5 reform movements are going to come out of it. Sometimes they're called the Second Great Awakening reform movements. Sometimes they're just called reform movements. Sometimes they're called antebellum reform movements because this did happen before the Civil War. One of the biggest issues was the consumption of alcohol. It was not uncommon for a gentleman to go out and drink. This is also the rise of the industrial America. So factories are going on. The market revolution is going on. Working with factories and alcohol is a disaster waiting to happen. The famous cartoon is The Drunkard's Progress, from the first glass to the grave. So early on, women tried to abolish alcohol. They had what was called the American Temperance Society, where they would go on with Frances Willard and they would try to just get people to stop drinking and saw the horrors of it. And it was men and women that really pushed for the banning of alcohol. This does not happen in the 1800s, but rather this ends up happening later on in the 1918, 1919 with the abolition of alcohol with the 18th Amendment and further passage of the Volstead Act. Originally, though, alcohol continued to dominate the nation throughout the 1800s. One of the famous reform movements at this time was named Dorothea Dix. She is going to lead the penitentiary reform and the penal system, which is basically saying that there are mental institutions that are going on. She did believe in mental health, and she tried to advocate for mental health for Americans, but they also did believe in prison system. Right here in our own backyard, Eastern State Penitentiary was built at this time. You can see the sunlight is the only window, and so they believe that salvation came from God. Of course, the very famous Al Capone stayed there as well, too. Another reform movement to talk about real quickly is the education reform movement. At this time, education was not important. Education was taken at home. It was the role of a woman to educate their child. It's kind of the ideas of Republican motherhood. But by the mid-1800s, there is becoming a huge push for public schools that are going on. You may remember from the Northwest Ordinance that one section of tax money had to be given towards public schools. And so public schools are going to increase at this time. The father of American education is Horace Mann. He believed that children were to be modeled and played. They could be molded into perfection. He was against corporal punishment in the classroom. He did not believe in beating students. And what he thought was, we need to train teachers to become teachers. So he created many state teacher programs across the country. Shippensburg University, where I graduated from, was a state teacher-run school originally. Horace Mann is going to push for education. Of course, we talked about Lincoln and others that go through. Women are going to start to go to school. Most of these schools are going to be segregated, boys and girls. You're going to have male schools. You're going to have female seminaries. And even some of the first females are going to college, as you see here in O'Brien College in Ohio. Another reform movement, and probably one of the biggest reform movements, and the one I want to spend the most time on, is women's rights. Up until the 1830s and the 1840s, women's job was considered the cult of domesticity. Her job was to stay at home, make babies, take care of the house, and provide that way. Starting in the 1830s, you're going to have the market revolution where you are going to have women going out into the workforce. You're going to see the Lowell girls in Massachusetts working as seamstress, but women are really going to start to fight for rights. The Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. The Constitution denies women the right to vote. And so women ultimately want one goal, and the one goal they really want is the right to vote. So a number of women are going to come together. Lucretta Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony are all going to come together, and they're going to form what is called the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments. They're going to meet in Seneca Falls in upstate New York in the 1848. And it's here in this meeting that women are going to come together and say, listen, we want to have rights. They want to have rights to equal pay. They want to have rights to voting rights and so on. Of course, Susan B. Anthony there on the left and Elizabeth Cady Stanton on the right are champions for women having the right to vote. They form what is called the Seneca Falls Declaration. And in the Seneca Falls Declaration, they literally recopy the Declaration of Independence. So instead of saying all men are created equal, it says all men and women are created equal. And what they wanted was just a basic understanding that women be treated just as equal as men. And it's a principle that was way overdue. It should have been done in 1776, but it wasn't. Louise May Alcott wrote a book out of this called Little Women and so on. One of the things that women are going to fight for in the Seneca Falls, obviously, is the right to vote. And we all know that this is denied all the way until 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. But one of the things that women are going to turn their attention to and agree upon in the Seneca Falls is we need to get African Americans the right to vote. If African Americans can get the right to vote, then surely women would get the right to vote. In 1870, there was a new amendment passed called the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed all males, regardless of race, have the right to vote. And they felt left out then, and it becomes another 50 years later, so women have the right to vote. Unfortunately, Susan B. Anthony, Lucretta Mott, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they didn't live to see the 1920s election, but their work was definitely one of the works that helped inspire the women to have the right to vote finally in 1920, 100 years ago. It's unbelievable. The other big abolitionist, social movement that comes out of this is the abolitionist movement. This is the freedom of slavery. There were different ideas. The American Colonization Society wanted to send everybody back to Africa, kind of similar to Marcus Garvey in the 1920s, but they believed that just send all the slaves back, we don't have a problem, and get rid of them. Obviously, that did not happen. They wanted to create a new country in Liberia. You're going to know later on that the capital of Liberia is Monroeville, which happens to be the president at the time. And W.E.B. Du Bois actually goes out to Liberia to do it. There was a huge movement. Guys like William Lloyd Garrison, in his newspaper, The Liberator, he says immediate emancipation. You're not getting reimbursed. We're going to free everybody right away. His famous paper was called The Liberator, and one of the things that he's going to champion for is his very famous saying, "I will be heard." We read that in class. You may remember he said, "I will not equivocate. I will not be scared. I will not shiver. You will allow slavery to be ended immediately." And there was a price for his head, but he wrote numbers of newspapers. There was others as well, too, that began to do this. This is The Liberator here, the newspaper from William Lloyd Garrison. Others like Harriet Tubman helped with the abolitionist movement by moving people from the South through the Underground Railroad. She helped over 300 slaves and was huge in pushing African Americans out of the South. One of the ways that abolition really works is with slaves. Many slaves did not run away. Many slaves did not fight back. But one of the best things that they started to learn in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s is passive resistance. What many slaves did were they broke their weapons. They worked slow. They just ruined economically slave owners that way. And we're going to find areas that there are huge chunks of slavery. South Carolina, Mississippi, populations over 50% slaves by the time the Civil War happens. And of course, we later on learn those are some of the most vicious states in the laws. So in Your Truth, Ain't I a Woman? Writing a number of books at this time. Harriet Jacobs writes Diary of a Slave Girl. Frederick Douglass, not only the writer of the North Star, but one of my favorite books of all time, The Narrative Life of Frederick Douglass. If you get a chance for an hour to sit down and read that book, you could knock it out in an hour. And he just talks about being beaten as a slave and being beaten and whipped. And he taught himself how to read and write and really became a huge person here in American history. And he's actually the first African American to run for president. Of course, not successful, but he did run for president. Again, the Underground Railroad. So all these reform movements came about. And the question that I have for you today that I want you to pose is one of two questions you can put. Question number one, were the reform movements successful? So think about all those 5 reform movements. Were they successful? And the second question I want to put in here is, was the Second Great Awakening, did it lead to the Civil War? And so I want to then go into religion a little bit here for a second. So did the Second Great Awakening cause the Civil War, or were these reform movements successful? So this is a question to take a look at early on. We find also the Second Great Awakening these reform movements start because of the rise of popular religion. You're going to see Alex de Tocqueville. He's going to write Americans books and how he was just so fascinated by how many Americans were actually really participating in religion here in America. This is all going to start in upstate New York. They call it the Burned Over District. In here, you're going to find new religions, new utopia communities that are going to be formed at this time. This famous Second Great Awakening, the revival meetings. So the First Great Awakening is going to see church sermons like Jonathan Edwards' Sinners at the Hands of an Angry God. This one's going to see guys like Finley and others that what they're going to do is they're going to go to these big camps and people are going to go out for these retreats, and it's going to be people that give these huge, massive speeches that come in, and thousands of people would show up at these meetings. And here Charles Finney, it was soul shaking, where you go praying back and forth and feeling the spirits of God. And this is all in a beautiful upstate New York. A new church that is also going to be founded is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, better known as the Mormons. Joseph Smith says he finds the Book of Gold in the Book of Mormons. He gets persecuted for his religion. They have to go on a trek. They're going to move out west. He does get murdered in Illinois. And so there is a lot of violence that is against the Mormons early on. And so Brigham Young is going to take them all the way to where you see here in the yellow. They call it Deseretta. Eventually gets shrunken down into Utah. And today, Utah is really the home of most of the Mormons. And you're going to find Utah and really northern parts of Idaho have a huge Mormon population today. Of course, Brigham Young, famous for that. Other religions that come out at this time or utopian communities are called the Shakers, where you will, by Mother Ann Lee, again, not a real huge religious area that comes out, but does improve talents. God will improve you. One of the things about the Shakers was they were simplistic. And one of the things that they didn't believe in is having sex. So obviously they didn't really last too long, as you can see here. And so again, simplicity and no sex meant no participation by the late 1800s. One of the other things that comes out at this time is the belief in nature and the belief in helping each other. So a new type of writers that come out at this time are called the Transcendentalists. These Transcendentalists believe in the soul, believe in nature, are pacifists. They are against war. They are against violence. They believe that God is there. They believe in nature. They believe in man. And they put these things together into books. And some of the most famous writers are going to be Emerson and Thoreau. Obviously, Emerson's known for nature. Thoreau is known for civil disobedience, which says you can be arrested and you should be arrested. You should protest unjust laws. And Thoreau was arrested because he refused to pay his taxes. Of course, they're always going to get you. Just ask Wesley Snipes. But they are going to, if you don't pay your taxes, you're going to go to jail. And he refused to pay taxes for the Mexican-American War. So in jail, he writes Resistance to Civil Disobedience. This book is later inspired by Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi in using passive resistance to get your message across. Um, Again, the transcendentalists, they wanted to give freedom to slavery. They believed in helping the poor, health to the sick. It was a progressive movement in their cells. Now, there were critics like Hawthorne who was against this to go through. There are other utopian communities, real quick, nothing you need to know about, but the noise, you have Brook Farm, you have the Oneidas, and so ultimately the Second Great Awakening comes about into this area. So, a couple questions I actually have. I'm going to come up with 3 questions. Question number 1: How did the Second Great Awakening start the Civil War? One of the things you're going to see is that it's very the Second Great Awakening is very northern. It's not a southern thing. It's a northern thing. So how did this create the Civil War? Another question to ask that you can use and give me back a response: Was the Second Great Awakening reform movement successful? So you think about all 5 of them, from abolition to women's rights, temperance, prison reform, and education. Were these reform movements successful? Which ones were? Which ones weren't? Another thing you could talk about is, how did the Second Great Awakening promote American nationalism? You could talk about how did the Second Great Awakening really promote nationalism at this time. So you think about in the 1820s and 1830s, we started to become our own country. How did these reform movements tie into the nationalism period? And then another question, if you want to do as well too, is compare and contrast the similarities and differences between the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. These are general type of essay questions that I could easily see a DBQ of. They had not done a DBQ on the Second Great Awakening since 2000 almost. So it's been almost 20 years since they've done one on that. 2002 is the last year they did it. So here's a question that you can think about: is, what were the similarities and differences between the First and Second Great Awakening? How did the Second Great Awakening and reform create nationalism problems? And then later on, you also want to talk about maybe were any of these reform movements successful. So give me your answer. Submit your answer on Flipgrade. You earn an extra point for that. Thank you for everybody that was meeting with me this week. Please try to do your vocabulary each day. Basically, make yourself a cheat sheet. Please spend about an hour a day studying. I promise you, if you do that, you'll get yourself a 5 on this AP exam. I'm going to do meetings in about 2 weeks, and I'll later supplement some stuff on it. So please subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. I hope everyone's staying safe among the COVID-19 outbreak. If you need laptops, you need to get them ASAP. So please message me or Mr. Crowder if you need a laptop. If you need anything, let me know. Talk to you later. Peace.